Good afternoon. Any professional military's preparedness can be assessed from its reforms. So, in the video today, I'll be discussing General Bipin Rawat's military reforms, which essentially have four key elements. He talks of a two-front war, cold start, integrated battle groups, and joint force. All these four elements eventually converge into the fifth one, which is theaterization, creation of a theater command. Now, these five items appear sort of very heavy stuff, but what I'll do in the video today is try and simplify them, connect the dots between these five issues so that we all understand exactly where the Indian military reforms are headed and hence its preparedness. So let me start with the first one, which is the two-front war. Now for this I have a story which unfortunately is true. In July 2006, President Bush, happy with Pakistan's participation in the global war on terror, officially called Operation Enduring Freedom, offered a hefty arms package worth $5 billion to the Pakistan military, essentially comprising of 26 new F-16s, upgrades of the existing F-16 fleet, select precision weapons and so on. So the key thing here was F-16s. This is the time that the Indian economy was doing well. So in an unusual move in India, the Prime Minister's office wrote letters individually to the three service headquarters, the Army, Air Force and the Navy, asking them that look, in view of the capabilities which have been offered by America to Pakistan, should the three service headquarters want additional funds to manage the edge against Pakistan? Now the two services most affected by this capability, as I said, centered around F-16. The Indian Air Force and the Indian Navy said that no, this capability will not tilt the edge in favor of Pakistan and we don't need additional funds. The Indian Army headquarters did not respond. Here they started thinking that look, if huge amounts are being offered by the PMO, this amount should not be let go. But the problem was how to get this amount into the Indian Army's kitty directly. Because if the Indian Army was to ask for equipment, the money would not come to them. Instead, the money would go to the Defense Ministry. So a lot of brainstorming sessions happened at Army headquarters and finally they came to the conclusion the only way to get money directly in their kitty was to seek an accretion of forces, more manpower. Now this was a troubling proposition for the simple reason that for many years the Defense Ministry had been putting pressure on the Army headquarters to reduce its manpower. The problem here was that the annual budget of the Indian Army, much was spent on the pay and allowances of the manpower, huge manpower that the Indian Army has, and minuscule was left for the capital acquisition or the weapon systems. So given this sort of a scenario, how was it possible for the Army headquarters to seek accretion? After many brainstorming sessions, it was finally concluded that the money could be brought in directly to the Indian Army kitty if they spoke of a two-front war, a war with Pakistan and with China simultaneously. Mind you, at that time in 2007 that we are talking of, nothing unusual was happening on the line of actual control with China. Now this was also the time at the Army headquarters, 2007, when the change of guard was happening at the highest level. The incumbent Army Chief, General J.J. Singh, was retiring and his successor, General Deepak Kapoor, was still not in chair. This gave enough time to the concerned directorates at Army headquarters to frame a reply to the PMO. Once General Deepak Kapoor took over the command, the letter was put up to him and under his signature, the answer sent to the PMO by the Army headquarters was that look, as far as Pakistan is concerned, we don't have to worry, this capability will not tilt the edge in their favor, but the problem is China. So they also offered, without giving a reason why the problem was China, the Army headquarters offered to give a presentation at the highest level of the PMO, which is the Prime Minister himself, to the Defence Ministry, and the then Defence Minister, Mr. A.K. Anthony, readily accepted that. So the presentation by the Army headquarters was set sometimes for December 2007. Mind you, the Army was to make a presentation on a two-front war when this whole issue had not been discussed at the Chiefs of Staff Committee, which comprises the three service chiefs. There was no collective decision making on the issue of two-front war. No wargaming had been done. Nobody had done a threat assessment of the PLA at that time. Worse, the chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee at that time, the Navy Chief, Admiral Suresh Mehta, was not even taken into confidence. In other words, the day when the presentation was set for, the two other service chiefs, they heard about this whole thing for the first time at the presentation. Now, the key presentation to the Prime Minister, amongst other people, his entourage, was made by the Military Operations Directorate, and the officer chosen to make the presentation was Brigadier Dipinder Hooda. Now, Brigadier Hooda is the same person who retired eventually as the Northern Army Commander, and he was the overall commander for the so-called 2016 surgical strike. Now, given the script by the Army headquarters, Brigadier Hooda argued two things. One, he said, is that Arunachal Pradesh is vast. So, as far as Army is concerned, there is a paucity of troops and we do not have good infrastructure in Arunachal Pradesh, whereby when the PLA does intrusions or ingressions or transgressions on the LAC in peacetime, so many times we do not even get to know about it. So this needs to be stopped. In other words, the requirement submitted to the government at the presentation was of 2 additional divisions for peacetime to check the transgressions made by the PLA on the LAC. That was one requirement. The second requirement that Brigadier Hooda spoke on behalf of the Army headquarters was that, look, in case of a two-front war, that means, let's say, Indian military is fighting a war with the Pakistan military. While it can take on the Pakistan military in a direct fight, the problem was, what if PLA also decides to get into the fight? So it was assessed and given out by Brigadier Hooda that after 2018, this presentation was made sometimes in December 2007. So after 2018, it was assessed by the Army headquarters that they will get a window of 30 days for the PLA to mobilize its requisite force to bring it into the theatre and launch it into war. So everything had to be done in that 30 days. And the argument was that, look, it cannot be done in 30 days because there is something called dual use formations which have been earmarked. Even if the dual use formations are to move from the Pakistan front to substantiate or to build up on the Chinese front, it would need to do certain critical or fundamental things. And these were, there was a need for acclimatization of the troops which are coming from Pakistan to the Chinese side, because as far as LAC is concerned, it is all in high altitude areas. Second would be the change of equipment, from the equipment in planes that it was using against Pakistan to the mountain equipment against the PLA. Third was, because of the rarefied air in the high altitude area, the weapons would need firing and they would need recalibration. Then the troops will need to be familiarized with this new terrain. Then a bit of training will be required. In other words, the concluding argument was, all this cannot be done in the 30-day window available after 2018. And hence, there was a need for organic or integral forces, accretion of forces with the Eastern Army Command to be able to do certain counter-attacks or to take on at tactical levels the PLA. And eventually we know that this was what they got in 2013 when Dapsang happened, and this came to be known as the 15 Corps. the strike corps they called it, which of course there was nothing strike about the corps. They are simply meant for counterattacks, the forces. And the first phase, what I said for the peacetime, this was, they got first. The army headquarters, the government sanctioned this, and this was something unprecedented, that our Army Chief General Deepak Kapoor, in his 3 years tenure, not only made a presentation for additional forces, also got 2 divisions, a accretion which had happened for the first time after 1983 in the Indian Army. A big deal. So, this was his legacy. And the Army Chief was certainly keen that his legacy be made public while he was still in service. So, in December 2009, addressing the officers at the Army Training Command in Shimla, Army Chief Deepak Kapoor made something like this of a statement, similar statement, where he spoke of that having firmed up successfully the cold start strategy, now the Indian Army should prepare for a 2-front war. He had spoken of 2 things, and of course his talk was leaked to the media. He spoke of a 2-front war capability building, and he spoke of the cold start having been firmed up. So we have to understand what is this cold start in a nutshell, which is at the heart of this two-front war. Now, cold start was a term which was coined in 2004 by the Army Chief General Nirmal Vij. It could be interpreted in 2 ways, the cold start. One way was, by definition, cold start means that, look, the moment the balloon goes up, the war is declared, you immediately cross over, it's cold start. No time is required, you are ready and you cross over and you launch in the enemy territory, that is cold start. And at the heart of this cold start, how do you launch with what forces, was the integrated battle group. Now, integrated battle group, this is the lesson which the army had learned from the 2001-2002 Operation Parakram, where one of the things observed was that the mobilization of the army took very long. So the idea was to telescope or to decrease the mobilization time. And the way found was integrated battle groups which are centered around a armor brigade. Now they would be positioned, these groups which are part of the strike corps, they would be positioned next to the holding corps. As we know, just to give a bit of a background to this, India and Pakistan in their deployments, of course things have changed now, I am referring to at that time. In their deployments, they have something called a holding corps or a pivot corps, which basically holds the ground, prepares the bridgehead, and then you have the strike corps which come and then they are launched into the enemy territory. This is how it works. Both the sides, they have a capability within 72 to 96 hours to get their pivot corps into ready for war. But as far as the strike corps are concerned, the Pakistan side has an advantage because given its elongated geography, they can mobilize their strike corps also in the same time frame of 96 hours, which is not possible for the Indian side because their strike corps are all over central India. So the integrated battle group was basically meant to, they are elements of the strike corps and they are supposed to be with the, few cantonments had to be made and some were made, some effort was put in there. So they will be there next to the pivot corps or the holding corps. And they'll get launched instead of the strike corps on our side. And then in the meantime, our strike corps will also fetch up and the strike corps will have a time of about 5 to 6 days to see where the main effort should go, depending on how the Pakistan side has reacted. And then you launch the main effort. So this was the meaning of cold start. So it could be interpreted like this. And the second way to interpret cold start was that, look, it was actually never a cold start. It was a proactive strategy, shortening the mobilization time with the help of integrated brigade groups of the Indian Army centered around our armored brigade, and this is precisely what it was. Now, the moment which uttered the word cold start, the Pakistani side took advantage of that and they announced what is called their full spectrum nuclear deterrence. That look, today we have a deterrence at the tactical level also, and this obviously sent a lot of alarm bells across world capitals. And the Indian Army, India decided that look, this terminology of cold start has to be dropped completely, and we will only call it proactive strategy. That is what it was. So this is now the background. Now enter General Bipin Rawat as the army chief, superseding two officers on 31st of December 2016 for a 3-year tenure. It was very clear right from the beginning that he had his sights much higher. So what did he do, General Rawat? First of all, as we all know, and I have said in my previous videos also, that the Modi government, once it came to power, it spelt out the threat. It was spelt out by the Prime Minister himself in the first Combined Commanders Conference in October 2014, that look, the enemy is known Pakistan, the threat is invisible terrorism. So that is your main effort that the Indian Army has to focus on. So alongside, this was what they were to do, is build up an image of a strong government, a government whose USP is to have a strong national defense and a strong army. So that is where General Rawat steps in as the army chief. So what does he do? That cold start terminology, he revives that, the first thing, as the army chief. So after a gap of 12 years, once again, India and the world hears the term cold start. And just in case people are wondering how exactly he would do the cold start, well, they had a perception of doing things, which is what we have seen with the Modi government. So as far as they were concerned, they did the cold start. Their 2016 surgical strike was a cold start. The 2019 Balakot attacks, air attacks, was a cold start. It doesn't mean, their interpretation was that look, we've just gone inside and come back. It was not about war. So he revived cold start. Now once he revived cold start, obviously the pivot of the cold start, as I explained earlier, were the integrated battle groups. So what he did was, in his tenure 3 years as the army chief, he picked up one battle group from the Western Command, which is facing the Pakistan side, and one from the Chinese side. And without bothering to know what exactly is the PLA advances in warfare, so they were at the tactical level. It was said that look, they have been test bedded, that means they have been experimented, and these battle groups at a tactical level have been successful. Now, next thing what he did, he came up with the Land Doctrine in 2018. Now this Land Doctrine argued in 2018 that look, the wars will be short and intense. So for such wars to come out a winner in such wars, it is important that there should be jointness. Now this word jointness was actually picked up 20 years back. It was said, when it was proposed by the Kargil committee report, that there should be a CDS, Chief of Defence Staff. It was proposed that look, there should be jointness amongst the forces. For the land war, obviously it meant jointness between the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force. So now Army Chief General Rawat argued that look, jointness is required. And for optimal jointness, he argued, we need a joint force. Joint force means that it is the elements of the Air Force are integral to that of the Army, whatever the integrated battle groups are there. So joint force. Now, for the joint force to be viable, it was argued that there should be theaterization. Instead of 17 single service commands, he proposed making 4 or 5 theatre commands. And how that would help is in 2 ways. One, it would create a joint force, because now the integral element of the Indian Air Force are there. And 2, with just about 4 or 5 theatres available, it will be easier to shift the forces from one front to another. The same dual use formations, in this case the integrated battle groups. That means in case of a war, he argued that look, we can shift the forces from left to right and right to left. This was, he argued, in 2018. that we can do that, and hence the need for theaterization. The Indian Air Force was not happy about it because it was never consulted. Now, this far what I have said, I have explained all these terminologies. Now I'll tell you the 5 big defects or the problems why we need to junk this whole thinking. Let's start with the first one. The concept of two-front war. Recall, in December 2007, when Brigadier Hooda made the presentation, he spoke of a 30-day window available to the Indian Army to move the forces, the dual-use formations from left to right. As we are aware, after 27 Doklam in 2018, no mobilization time was required for the PLA because they were sitting right there. In the Tibet Autonomous Region, they were sitting in the Xinjiang Military Division. So, even that opportunity was not available. And yet, General Bipin Rawat, and in January 2020, once he became the CDS for another 3 years, the first CDS of the country, and his successor, Army Chief General Naravane, he argued in his first press conference in January 2020, absolutely opposite of what was argued by Hooda so many years back. Now he is saying with the PLA sitting in Tibet Autonomous Region that look, we will have a primary front and we will have a secondary front. So, how we will manage this is, one front will be held, the secondary front will be held defensively, we will fight on the primary front, and once we have fought and gained advantage at the primary front, we will then move the forces to the secondary front. Nothing was war gamed. So, when this sort of a thinking is there, that means you are basically, if I can use a very harsh word, you are misleading your command, you are misleading your army by telling a lie. Now, second point, let's consider the joint force that he talks about. What theaterization, in theaterization, the whole idea, the thinking of the Indian Army is that look, these integrated battle groups which have been created against Pakistan and against China, for example, the ones against China, they will take on the combined arms brigade of the PLA army. That means there will be a direct fight between the integrated battle groups of the Indian Army and the combined arms brigade of the PLA. Similarly, as far as the Air Force is concerned, Air Force said that all right, we have an advantage of having lot of air bases and at lower heights, so we have an advantage, tactical advantage, we can carry more payload, more fuel than the PLAF, PLA Air Force. So, given this advantage, we will be able to take on our Rafales and the Sukhois will be able to take on the PLA's J-20 and J-31s. The whole problem is, now we are talking of tactics versus operations. This needs explaining. Because the mindset of the Indian Army and the Air Force and the Navy also is so tactical, because they've only been focused on Pakistan all these decades, that the belief that this theaterization will be done, they don't seem to understand that they, by a joint force, they will actually end up with a suboptimal outcome. Why this will happen is because when you have only two war domains, both the war domains, they have their core competencies. For example, the core competency of the land forces, in this case the Indian Army, it is combined arms operations. The core competency of the Indian Air Force or any Air Force is its flexibility, surprise, range and accuracy, precision. These are the core competencies. Now, when you have Army in the lead and the Air Force supporting it, that means the Air Force is working suboptimally. Therefore, even if it was said 20 years back, it was wrong. When you have two war domains, you do not need jointness, you need coordination. That is all that you need. For example, in Operation Desert Storm in 1991, under General Norman Schwarzkopf, in the war that the Americans fought against the Iraqis, what they had was coordination and not jointness. First, the Air Force did its sorties for the first about 44 days, and then the army was called in, and in 100 hours the war was over. So you do cooperation, which is not the case with the PLA today, because as far as PLA is concerned, as I've explained in my earlier videos also, they are not doing tactics. Against Indian Army is two domains for a land war: the air and the land. They have 6 domains today. They can fight on land, they can fight in air, they can fight in outer space, they can fight in near space, they can fight in electromagnetic spectrum, and they can fight in cyber. What this means is that it will not be the integrated battle groups versus combined armed brigades. It will be integrated battle groups versus mission sets. The mission set will be decided by the PLA commander, that what is it that I use asymmetrically for an optimal outcome. The focus is outcome. Give you an example. For example, there will be no dogfights. There will be no fights at all between the Sukhoi 30s and the Rafale and the J-20 and the J-31 that the Indian Army and the Air Force are expecting and analysts are expecting to happen. What will happen is the PLA will start the war on its strength, and the strength is their missiles, surface to surface missiles. That will be the first line of attack. Then they will bring in their strategic support force, which is the electronic warfare to jam the communications to blind the enemy. Electronic warfare and cyber war capabilities, they will be brought in. Once they have blinded the enemy, thereafter, now they bring in their bombers, and all they are networked. I mean, all the details are there in this book, The Last War, which has just come out. I would suggest even on the two-front war, there's a full chapter in this book, which is called The Myth of Two-Front War, and the war, how it will happen, is explained in this. Now, coming back to what I was saying, so this joint force, when you create a theater, when you co-locate the commands, you are actually putting your you're compromising on the core competency of your two services with suboptimal results that will come. Simple. What you need instead are communications. Communications between the army and the Air Force in an adversarial environment. An environment which will be very heavy with enemy electronic warfare, where it will have a superiority in the electromagnetic spectrum and its cyber war capabilities. So that is my next point. Now consider the third point. All this talk about cold start and we will get into Pakistan this way, that way, you cannot do anything. You cannot do anything is because Pakistan military matches you at the conventional level of war, despite the fact that both the militaries have similar war concepts. And why they match you is, I have said repeatedly, because in the last decades since independence, you have not been able to obliterate the line of control. So this whole talk of cold start is complete baloney. Let me add a little more. Today a situation has come with PLA support. I've explained this in great detail in my book, The Last War, where they perhaps overmatched the Indian military. We have to be cognizant of that. We have to be aware of that. Next, fourth point, there is still no understanding of PLA war at all. There is no realization that the PLA will fight a combination of 3 wars. The first is the information war, or what is also called the grey zone operations, where the key element will be cyber war in the whole of nation. That is the key thing. The second war is informatized war, which is a war to blind you, which will be done by the 2 specialized organizations, the Strategic Support Force and the Rocket Force. And this is enough, the informatized war, to have a decisive edge even today. I'll just come to that in a little while. And the third war that they will fight is their intelligence-sized war. because they have two major advantages. Number one is they have operational data. This is the robotic war I'm talking of. And number two, the traditional networkings. I mean, in any case, Indian military is not networked at all. The Air Force is not networked, the Army is not networked, the Navy is not networked, and they are not networked amongst one another. Now the Chinese are at a stage in the robotic war where the traditional networks will be dispensed with and will be replaced by combat cloud, which will minimize the adversarial environment of electronic warfare and cyber. So the key point I'm making here is very simple. All the analysts who keep talking about that, look, what I have written in my book perhaps may be right, but the timelines are wrong. The PLA still needs about 10 to 15 years to really be prepared for this war that he is talking about. No. The PLA is today prepared with its information war and informatized war. They are ready today. They have that capability to go to war if they want to go for a decisive war. As far as intelligence-sized war is concerned, that is a plus, that is a gain that they are looking at. To have a first user advantage against their peer adversary competitor, which is the US military. And my next video will be on this only, to explain that don't be under the illusion at all that there are 10-15 years available. They are right there, and you have to now, I will explain why I say that in my next video, and why you have to resort to proper intelligent statecraft to take on China. And my last point on this is, this whole thing that I spoke of, these reforms, the 5 or 6 elements, they are all army driven. In the war that we are talking of, the hyper war, where you have 6-7 domains at work, we are talking of speed and tempo of war. And for God's sake, the Indian Army will have the least speed and the least tempo of war. How can they be the kingpins in the reforms? In other words, there is a need to junk these reforms. Why I am saying this is because I want the Indian military to be strong. Therefore, having said this, I have already explained the next video that I will be doing. Until then, thank you.